morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to a broadcast from the MDB Pavilion at COP26 in Glasgow. I'm Steve Hammer. I'm a climate policy advisor at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Today we're going to talk about long-term strategies, which are increasingly viewed by policymakers, academics, and the larger global policy community as a critical element of efforts to help countries achieve net zero emissions by mid-century. So what's a long-term strategy? We've all heard about NDCs. We've been talking about them for some time. Those are required as an element of the Paris Agreement. Not so for long-term strategies, although they are recommended as an important piece of the picture. The Paris Agreement doesn't require countries to develop a long-term strategy, but it is recommended because it provides that long-term context that gives shape to the NDC and whether it remains on track to deliver on those long-term goals. Long-term strategies allow governments, and those watching governments, frankly, to assess whether an NDC is delivering on the targets we need, or whether it's taking us on an incorrect pathway. For MDBs, long-term multilateral development banks, long-term strategies are also the source of important information. You may be aware that the World Bank and other MDBs have been working for the last several years on a framework to assess the Paris alignment of our lending, of our investment support, and whether that type of support is actually helping countries move towards their targets and commitments. We talked about our Paris alignment work this past Wednesday in a session that was hosted by the European Investment Bank, and hopefully you saw that session as well. In today's session, we're going to talk to practitioners about what it means to develop a strategy, what went into that process, what some of the challenges were, and what lessons they think they hold domestically, but also internationally for other countries who are trying to develop these plans on their own. We're also going to hear from experts who have been involved in advising governments on how to do this work, as well as consumers of this information, those who have to look at this policy frameworks that are being developed and decide what that implies in terms of investments or policy decisions that they need to make. So we're going to start off with a presentation by Kyun, who is with the climate team at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, who will provide an overview of the common principles the MDBs have worked on together over the last several years. We'll then hear from Carolina Urmeneta, the head of climate change at the Ministry of Environment for the government of Chile. After hearing the country perspective, we'll then turn to our international experts. Richard Barron, the executive director of the 2050 Pathways Platform, Taka Kato from the OECD's Environment Directorate, and Alsbeta Klein, the Director General of the International Fertilizer Association. Each will bring a different perspective about how LTSs can be done to maximize their value, both domestically and internationally, and from an investment perspective. So I'm going to start by turning it over to Sung-Ah. Please.
Thank you, Steve. Can I have the slides? It is an honor for me to be presenting on the MDB's support for long-term strategies on behalf of the MDB's working group on Paris alignment. Today, I'll be briefly giving you a context to our Paris alignment work, and then explaining why long-term strategies are critical in the green and climate resilient transitions, and what are the principles that are going to be guiding our work on long-term strategy, and then update you briefly on the works that the MDBs are doing so far and the ways forward. So many of you may recall that in 2017, the MDBs committed to aligning their financial flows to the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And in 2018, at COP24, we presented our Paris alignment framework comprised of 6 main building blocks. Building block number 4 is dedicated to our support to clients and countries on their climate policy work. And policy dialogue, engagement, and technical assistance under the building block number 4 it is critical to not only achieving the Paris alignment objectives, but also to allow, it's an integral part of the MDB's operational model, enabling the building block number 1 and building block number 2, which are aligning our operations with the mitigation and adaptation goals of the Paris Agreement. At COP25, we announced our intention to develop high-level principles on long-term strategies, and that will also help increase ambition over time. So, long-term strategies are critical to help with the green and climate resilient transition because they help set the long-term national, subnational, sectoral, and regional goals to guide near-term investment decisions. LTS enables pathways for decarbonization, building climate resilience, avoiding stranded assets, and facilitating green and just transition for the economy and society. Long-term strategy also provides key reference points for countries' climate and development planning and policy reforms, including the updating of the NDCs. Multilateral development banks have been working on supporting various long-term strategy development efforts in many countries, but as you can see on the right, there are still quite a number of long-term strategies that needs to be that are absent, and particularly from the developing countries. To give you an example of the MDB's engagement, so despite the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been expanding our support to countries in developing their NDCs and long-term strategies. We did a stock take last year, and over 96 countries, we have supported NDC and long-term strategies, which is more than 50% of the previous year. Specifically on long-term strategies, we have 69 MDB engagements in 39 countries, which is more than doubled since 2019. And we have had 15 MDB engagements on just transition at regional country level, covering various sectors. So we have worked together as MDBs over the past year to come out with these 8 key principles to the long-term strategies. The first principle is about setting a long-term vision for a decarbonized and climate resilient future. The second principle is about linking with the sustainable development goals and maximizing the socioeconomic benefits and supporting just transition. Principle 3 is about honoring and respecting the underlying principles of the Paris Agreement, including the temperature goals and the early peak emission, and taking into account country context, as well as to introduce short and medium milestones to achieve that long-term objectives. Principle 4 is about integrating adaptation and climate resilience goals. And it's also important that we cover key sectors and systems to capture the interlinkages and interdependence under a range of plausible scenarios. Principle 6 is about ensuring country ownership, and Principle 7 is about inclusive, transparent stakeholder engagement, and Principle 8, last but not least, to ensure that there's an appropriate institutional capacity to implement, monitor, and update LTS so that we ensure that the LTS process remains dynamic. To close, in terms of our way forward, MDBs will continue to support countries to mobilize finance, build capacity, and provide knowledge and other support to implement and update their NDCs. We'll also continue to collaborate and scale up our efforts to bring climate to the heart of the long-term development planning and to align NDCs with the long-term plans. We will also lead and innovate, but also to inform the emerging Paris alignment approaches by the public and private sector investors, as well as development partners. And lastly, we'll accelerate the support by linking our short-term policy and investment priorities, such as by phasing out greenhouse gas intensive technologies, helping to resolve the data gap issues, set a realistic country-driven strategies, and reducing overall climate risks and unlocking economic opportunities for green growth, and enabling an understanding for adaptation and climate resilience finance and investments. Lastly, we're currently working on jointly seeking for additional funding to scale up our work on long-term strategies, and we're excited about the work that is ahead of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Sunga. So we're going to turn now to Carolina. You're the pro in the room. 2 years ago, you were on the hot seat. Your government was serving as the COP president at COP25 in Madrid. But at the same time, you had a full plate at home. And one of the things I know you were starting to work on at that point was the country's long-term strategy. Can you talk to us a bit about the process that was involved, about where you landed in terms of the recommendations? And one of the things that, from our perspective at the World Bank, we're particularly interested in is how it links to the development vision that the government may have already had, but now climate became a more important factor, or something that was it was necessary to weave it in a more comprehensive way. So how did you do that, and did it force you to revisit some of that vision of where you wanted to land economically, socially, in terms of other development metrics, over a 20 to 30 year time frame?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. And in fact, it was a long journey, but we are really happy, that's true. We started the development of this long-term strategy on May of 2020 with a previous process of participation. And there, the World Bank was a key. You helped us a lot in order to design the process and in order to implement that process. And it was a very successful process. It participated 2,000 persons. And with that process, we defined, like you were asking, what are the main issues that we are going to have in our long-term strategy. But what was important, it was that we recognize what we already have. And we based our work on science. So we have a bill, a climate change framework bill in the Congress that set the goal of carbon neutrality and resilience by 2050. Okay, so we knew that that was our goal. Okay, and the other thing that we already knew when we started the long-term strategy was that we have our NDC. Our NDC was updated on April 2020, and there we have an intermediate goal. Okay, by 2030. So we have that information, we have a previous participation process, and what we want in our long-term strategy was to go to one step behind national goals, okay? So in the long-term strategy, we established sectorial goals. And for example, we had a carbon budget in our NDC from 2020 to 2030, and we assign that budget to 7 sectors. Which sectors? Energy, transport, mining, agriculture, infrastructure, housing, and waste. So we established in our long-term strategy the maximum, the carbon budget of that sectors in order to really know what is the maximum capacity of emission that they would have, okay? And that is very important because with that, we set like the road that we are going to build. And in order to build this, we use 5 pillars, okay? One is governance, which is really important and is established in this bill that was approved unanimous in the Senate, and now we are in the lowest chamber. The other one is cost effectiveness, and there also the World Bank and the Interdevelopment Bank help us a lot. With you, we developed a study that showed us that carbon neutrality was an opportunity to Chile. And in fact, it represents 0.4% of a higher GDP if we compare with our reference scenario, okay? And with the Interdevelopment Bank, we did a robustness analysis of like 1,000 of scenarios, okay? So we knew what things do the sectors need to look in order to go for their goals, okay? The other pillar is nature-based solution, which is based in order to have adaptation and mitigation. The other one is the social pillar, like the one was telling before. We use sustainable development goals and also just transition. We are closing our coal plants, and we need to do that with a just transition strategy. And the most important pillar and the one that base everything is science. So that is how we say to the sectors, okay, you must do this, but you need to consider this. And the long-term strategy considers also adaptation. And for that, we are using our risk map, okay? Like this is an atlas where we have information regarding the impact of the climate change on each municipality of Chile, okay? So we are saying you have this information for 12 sectors like energy, mining, tourism, agriculture, etc. And we need to develop goals and indicators, a system, in order to monitoring the adaptation. So that is what our long strategy considers, and what I think, you didn't ask me, but I would like to tell you, our main challenge is regarding monitoring, reporting, and verification. I think there we need a lot of support, and we need to work a lot, because now we need to go with transparency in order to show that we are making this happen. We have the road, it's a road based on science, but we need now to show that we are doing this. We know we're doing this, but we need to show it.
So, I mean, first off, you know, bravo that you've developed such a comprehensive strategy. I mean, the thing that you were talking about, the number of sectors, establishing a carbon budget for each, showing the cost effectiveness of that, all of that speaks to a lot of moving parts, and there are going to be some winners, and maybe there are folks or sectors that won't do as well. And so the politics must have been quite extraordinary around that. So can you talk a bit about kind of how you manage the process within government, but then also how are you managing all of these stakeholders who obviously want to weigh in because they're very interested in what the future might hold for them?
Yes, I think, well, it helped us a lot that we were presidency of COP25. So the climate change theme was, everyone was talking about this. Also, I think what is really important is to recognize what we have done. We didn't start from nothing, okay? We have adaptation plans, we have our NDC, we have this project lab, and we put this together. Because one thing that happened to the sectors is that they don't understand. It's like they say, you again, you're asking me things. You already asked me this. Now you're saying me that I need to have carbon budget? No, it's too much. And we said them, okay, if you don't have it, we will have problems, because we don't know. We need to set goals in order to know that we are making this happen, okay? So that was really important. And of course, the teams that we have in the Environmental Minister and in other sectors are really good. It is true that we have ministries that are that have a lot of capacities on this, so it is easier to work with them because they know and they have a lot of information, and another ministries that do not have. And if you go to our long-term strategy, you will see that, because you will see that we have really robust sectors, okay, that have goals, that have numbers, that have everything like, wow, you say, okay, this is. And the other ones that is, okay, this is the first step. And I think it's important to recognize this, because when you have this information and when you put it and when you deliver this information to the UNFCCC, you said, okay, this is my status. Yes, I recognize I do not have everything solved, of course not, but we need to work on that. And for that, the support and the work together with international organizations like the World Bank and the others MD banks, it's really important, because you help us to say the other sectors, okay, this could be done, okay, and this is happening. And when you have the finance sectors, and in our case, the finance ministry working together, well, things happen, because you are seeing like the root of development of the country. So I think that is important.
So one last question before I want to move on. I had raised this question of the country had a pre-existing long-term development strategy, but now we're introducing climate more forcefully into the conversations. Do you see differences in terms of what might have been written in the National Development Plan from 5 years ago or 10 years ago and what you're saying today as a result of this long-term strategy work? What changed, or did anything change, or were you already on a very good track?
No, a lot changed, because we put climate change as a goal, okay? That you are talking about our green development strategy, and yes, that was something that we have, but it was like, it says that it's go to long term, but for example, it doesn't have a goal. Now we have a goal, and now we have a goal for 2050, an intermediate goal for 2030, and sectoral goals. That is something that we didn't have in Chile, okay? The other one was like the first step, if you ask me, okay? Really good, because it was important, and it helped us in order to develop that, what we have now. And I hope, like in 5 or 10 years more, someone else said, okay, this is. And what is important also, and I'm just going to finish, is that these instruments are recognized in our bill, okay? And the bill, for example, established that we are going to update the long-term strategy in 10 years, okay? But if in 5 years we update our NDC according what Paris Agreement mandate us, and we have like a very ambitious goal, okay? Because we, I don't know, discovered that green hydrogen was like biggest in Chile, and we have a lot of invention and everything. We have like a quick update process of the long-term strategy regarding specifically the carbon budget. Because if not, we are going to have two instruments that doesn't talk with each other, and we have considered that in the law. So that is good also, I think.
Great. Thanks very much. Richard, I want you to come in now. The 2050 Pathways platform is unique as an international institution because you specifically focus on long-term strategies, and I mean, it's clear that you're in the middle of many, if not most, LTS discussions that are going on around the world. So talk to us. First, I want you to just kind of react to what you heard from Carolina and Chile's experience and where Chile is heading. Does this sound familiar, or did they go in a different direction than what you've been seeing in other countries?
Thank you, Stephen. It does sound very familiar in terms of the countries that are coming to this now and adopting a very well thought through approach with a central point on stakeholders engagement and a full integration of what the national plans looks like and what it says about the ongoing issues that decarbonization might bring to the country and how to solve and find opportunities coming out of that. Now, what we also see is, of course, at this stage, we went from 4 long-term strategies that were submitted back in 2022 to now about 40, including some major economies. So we're hopeful that this is actually being picked up by a number of countries who think that they have to look at the long-term deep decarbonization to figure out what it means to set themselves on the right track. So I think there will be more coming as well. We expect about 50 by the end of the COP, some of which we provided support to, and very much are doing what Chile described, looking at a vision, trying to bring people around the table to understand what it actually means and where people see points that they would need to sort out potential trade-offs, but also areas where they think that there are new opportunities coming up. And certainly Chile, in terms of its renewable energy supply and so on, can actually look at a long-term with a position that is probably far more positive than it did when we looked at this 10 years ago. So that's quite encouraging. Now, we have also heard during the COP many new announcements of countries aspiring to reach net zero by the middle of the century. By that, I mean bringing their emissions down and capturing the rest of the emissions to have a net zero climate contribution, which is very encouraging. The total numbers now point to the possibility, if all these are delivered, reaching 1.9 degrees. So getting for the first time a number of pledges which altogether would take the world below 2 degrees if we implement those. And that's where we need to come in. That's where countries need to actually turn around and look to other countries who've done this, Chile and the others, to say, how do we build those strategies? We need plans to actually deliver on these very ambitious goals. And that's, I think, what has been the highlights of what's been going on at COP so far.
So one of the things I'm also interested in, and again, I know that your organization tries to facilitate this, is exchange between those who are involved in this work from country to country. Caroline is now a global expert on this. Is there a move to try and make sure that other countries can leverage all the knowledge and experience that she and her colleagues in the Chilean government have obtained over the last few years from this work, so that they can, A, learn what to do right, but also what mistakes to avoid along the way?
Yeah, definitely. So the 2050 Pathways platform was essentially built around that principle of having a collective space where all these governments were trying to do this work from scratch. This had not been done before. There were modeling studies, but nothing like a strategy with a process to bring it all together. So we're there to create a space where they can exchange and learn and create best practice. But I think we need to broaden that scope. I think we also need to take the measure of what needs to happen now, and that is considerable support to places in the world where countries have made commitments and have not started elaborating their long-term strategies. I'm thinking of Africa, I'm thinking of Southeast Asia in particular, Central Asia as well. I think IDB has done a very good job in the Latin American region that has led to a good number of countries there bringing their long-term strategies together. But we need to step up. We need more support. We need more funding for this work, and also in a way that is probably more coordinated, in a more orderly fashion as well, because we are seeing on the ground that there's a lot of different pockets to support work that goes in this direction and that is very rarely brought together. I think it's time that the MDBs and the development agencies which large maybe coordinate a bit on this and join forces to advance this, because we do not have a lot of time to bring emissions down to zero, and those plans are extremely ambitious. And I think to maybe follow up on that thought, it's also quite critical that the long-term strategies are not a document, but that they are a process. The document is just something you submit to the UNFCCC and helps others assess what's been going on and engage each other, and that's great. But from there on, where MDBs and development agencies can be useful is by saying we're going to follow up from this to investment decisions and infrastructure decisions and policy decisions now. The accountability of long-term strategies rests on the ability of actors like the World Bank, EBRD, the MDBs, ADBs on the panel as well, IDB, I mentioned them, and many others that are here today, to be able to actually follow through the recommendations that the long-term strategies present, so that it becomes a bit of a partnership guidance document that you can go back to and say, this is what we collectively, this is what the country wants to do, and this is where we need to pull them.
Great, thanks very much. Taco, I want to jump to you now. OECD has long played an important role in terms of trying to help governments develop new policies and plans, share information across governments. So that knowledge exchange is fundamental to what OECD does. Increasingly, you're being asked to engage on long-term strategy issues. What has that meant operationally for you? You're being asked to bring new information or new ideas or new methods to the table. How have you had to adjust the type of advisory support or technical support that you all provide for this new and different kind of plan or strategy?
Thank you so much. I do agree that long-term strategy is a very important compass, if you like, to guide the countries to go on the journey towards the decarbonization for the next decades to come. So we need to act now, we need to reform the policies now, we need to invest massively now, but we have to make sure that the policy reforms and investments are aligned and compatible with the long-term vision of for the net zero emissions by mid-century. So I'm very pleased to hear about your remarks about the carbon budget and also the 1.9 degrees figure as well. So also, in terms of the OECD work, my OECD colleagues have conducted the cross-country analysis of the long-term strategies or long-term low-emission development strategies. So I'd like to share a few sort of thoughts based on that in the context of especially the comprehensive view of comprehensive integration of climate change issues into the development planning and infrastructure investment. The first one is about the clear vision and targets. So for that, we need the very high level political support, and also ideally endorsed by the highest level of the government. That means a lot to the implementation of the long-term strategies. Relating to that, be the strong institutional setup and the legal frameworks. So, for example, some of the countries that we studied, the creation of the long-term strategies was mandated by law, and the targets and goals have become legally binding goals in some countries like the United Kingdom. And then the thirdly, and also before the third point, I would also like to mention that these long-term strategies have to also translate into the bylaws and the more concrete policy instruments, which is a decisive step for the implementation of the strategies as well. So then the science part, I also find your remarks really interesting, because science and probably models more specifically are really important in a way for getting the clear sort of targets, but at the same time also to identify the synergies between the climate policies and the other policy priorities as well in countries. And the fourth point is, again, lots of people already mentioned the just transition issues and also the social inclusion as well. So I've been working with the Central Asian countries, for example, and there are a few countries who have been already starting the development of long-term strategies, and the World Bank and EBRD and other MDBs have been supporting them. But there are obviously areas where people really reliant on the extractive industries, and for them, for the workers there, in the sectors that might be phased out as a consequence of the implementation of the long-term strategies, they may need the policy compensation or social safety net, or the reskilling of the workers and so on. So I think this sort of well-being aspect of the long-term strategy is also crucial for credibility of the strategy and also the political buy-in for implementation as well.
So one thing, and I just want to do a very quick follow-up. Both Richard and you and Carolina, you talked about carbon budgets, and this has come up now a few different times. Is a long-term strategy only focused on mitigation, or does it, I mean, Richard, you talked about Africa, and we're probably not looking at massive emissions coming out of some of those countries. So is it a situation that long-term strategies can have a primarily adaptation focus if necessary? Is that something that you're advising folks on at OECD?
No, I think some of the countries we studied in that study that I mentioned, they did actually their strategies did include the focus on adaptation as well. So I don't think this is exclusively for mitigation effort. And also there are lots of points that we can highlight in terms of the interlinkages between the mitigation and adaptation. And nature-based solutions is one thing as well. So we definitely should sort of pursue the maximizing the synergies between the mitigation and adaptation as well. And also through the development of the long-term strategies, it could be probably useful to identify where some trade-off between adaptation and mitigation exists, because this may not be able to explicitly find it when we are working on the low emission development strategies and national adaptation plans in separate ways. So maybe through the long-term strategies work, we could probably identify both trade-off and areas for synergies as well.
Elzbieta, let's turn to you now. We invited you because you've got an extensive, professional, track record focusing on how to grow climate investments. Part of that has always been an issue of how do you translate the policy landscape in a given country, and what are the implications for investors or for the real economy. Again, when you hear a long-term strategy discussion and folks start talking about a carbon budget, is that going to scare investors? Or how does the long-term strategy have to be structured in a way that it gives you the information you need so that you can make sound investment decisions going forward?
Thank you, Steve. So first of all, thank you for the invite to this gathering. It's really, really important to hear how you went about working on it and what are the policy recommendations that you have, because for us in the industry, if NDCs are the broad directions of where we want to go, long-term strategies are these recipes, the cookbooks of how we actually get there. And today I represent one of the hardest to decarbonize industries in the world, but we have a pretty noble mission. We try to help feed the world sustainably. That is why we are working on what we are working on. And when I was listening to, especially to you, Carolina, on carbon budgets, I think it's essential to have those because it gives the industry a playbook of what needs to be done. What is the regulatory environment going to bring? How to present investment opportunities, what is the carbon price going to be potentially, so that green hydrogen, green ammonia is going to pay off or not, depending on the regulatory environment. So it is really essential to take the NDCs and bring them into long-term strategies which are dependent on a country-specific situation so that the industry can react in a particular way. And we have heard at this COP a number of investors making very bold commitments as to what they are going to fund, how they are going to fund transition, and how much money they're going to put on that transition. So I think the clear policy environment that gives signals both to investors, but before you have investors, you have to have somebody who wants to invest, who wants to actually make the capital commitment. So having that clarity is going to be essential. And I'm really pleased to see how many countries you have guided multilateral development banks on the road to longer-term strategies, which will open up some of these opportunities, both for mitigation and for adaptation investments.
So Richard mentioned that there are discussions underway here in Glasgow within the negotiating rooms about long-term strategies, and that's part of the discussion now. If we asked you to look in the camera and speak to the negotiators, what are the kinds, you talked about the cookbook, the recipe, what are the kinds of things you want to see in that recipe so that it gives you and your members, businesses out there, the information they need so that they understand what that policy landscape looks like?
Great question, and here's my wish list. So first and foremost, When you think about feeding the world, you have a lot of industries that are emitting a lot of carbon, but you have an opportunity inherent in the agriculture, and that opportunity is called soil carbon. Carbon in soil can be preserved, can be stored, can be the opposite side of that balance sheet. So if I had request number 1 to the negotiators, can you please make progress on Article 6? Article 6 would give all of us clarity on how carbon will be treated, what the budgets will be, and how we position investments for the future. I have a second wish, if I may, that's not necessarily to the negotiators, but to all of you at the multilateral development banks and ministries. We need carbon price. We need carbon price because carbon price is going to help companies determine policy environment of the future, and carbon price is going to steer investments in the right direction. And most importantly, it's going to bring us innovation that we all need to have.
All right, thank you for that. Richard, one of the things that, again, I'm really interested, the extent to which the issues that Alzbeta has just raised, the kinds of ideas that provide the strong policy signals, she says, would be most helpful to businesses out there, to investors out there. Are you seeing that in the long-term strategies? Have they gotten better at that as time has gone on?
I don't think that's been the primary purpose, but I think it's the logical next step. So the primary purpose of long-term strategies, and I'm not talking about EU countries where the policy landscape is pretty clear, but it's been for countries to comprehend what it will take to bring their emissions down, physically speaking. Mm-hmm. So it's not about how much they need to purchase carbon from overseas to compensate. It's about figuring out their internal capacity and the challenges in actually reaching physical net zero in their countries. And then comes the question, okay, now that I have this, for some countries of fairly large size, the question is going to be, what policy do I need to put into place immediately to steer my boat towards this direction? For smaller countries who have fewer sets of sectors, they will need to immediately move to the infrastructure investment phase and steer their economy in such a way. The policy discussion, I think, comes next, and I think I'd like to go straight into more complexity there. These are countries that do not just have one issue, which is climate. They have a number of other development issues, and the policy prescription has to take all of this into account. There might be issues around spurring investments, around governance, around the policy signals, yes. But I don't think for a lot of them, it's going to be just about, for instance, carbon pricing. I think it is helpful in some sectors. I don't think it's helpful to all economies and all markets. We will need to go quick because this is a deep decarbonization agenda, and countries do not have a lot of time to play around with signals. I think they need to get a good direction and good policy decisions on what it actually takes to bring physically their emissions down to zero. And all policy instruments from now on are on the table. I think people are thinking as much about how you spur innovation with pricing, but also how you draw innovation into the market with public procurement and carbon accounting of goods, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a more complex, but it's more complex because countries are starting to deal with the real issues and not dealing with this in theory.
So, I mean, you actually made a really nice segue for me, wanting to get to one of the issues. You talked about the complexity, the multiple issues that governments are needing to juggle, and Carolina made the exact same point. And, one of the questions I'd love anybody on the panel who wants to jump in on this address is, how do you handle, Carolina, you characterized it as inconsistent levels of information or analysis across sectors. But if you're making a strategy that is so consequential in terms of the development trajectory of a country, having uneven information, makes that pretty difficult. And I could imagine a situation where you kept feeling like, well, let's just wait until we have that one more study, that one more piece of information, and then I feel confident that we could actually put the best plan out. But if you do that, all of a sudden, Richard said, we don't have a lot of time to get this done. So you've got the timing and the need to act urgently, but you've got the challenge of incomplete or uncertain information in some cases. So how do we balance those? as, how would you advise other governments to think through, sometimes you need to just take that leap and put the plan out and then fix it along the way? Or are there some things that are so fundamental that you really shouldn't put a plan out until you have some of this information in hand?
Yes, that is a really good question, and it's a fact, of course. I think there are two main things. One is that you need to have science, okay? Because in our case, for example, science told us very clear that we need carbon neutrality, and we did the exercise like in the big picture, okay, with a lot of variables and scenarios, and that exercise showed us that this is good for Chile, okay? And when you have that, you said, okay, we are going to there. And you don't have everything solved, but you go. And I think what is the other important thing is to have an authority leading this process that believe in this. And with that, I'm referring to our President Piñera, who mandated us to build this. He believes really in carbon neutrality for Chile and to have this instrument. And of course, when you have like a leading like that, we all work on that. So I think that is two big issues that help us in order to have this long-term strategy.
Okay, Richard or Taka, would you like to jump in on this question of incomplete or uncertain information? Richard?
If I may, so first of all, it has to be a process and it has to be ongoing. I think inclusiveness is what's going to drive robustness. I also think that you also need to look beyond borders. It's very important for those sectors that are reluctant, doubtful, uninformed to actually turn around and ask, through federations like IFA and others, to solutions. Because in many cases, the same multinationals are operating there. Because the solutions are being developed elsewhere already. The question is, can you bring this quickly to the country? Can you make this part of the discussion, including in assessing the potential for mitigation and so on and so forth, and be honest and quick to actually bring that information in. But I think having a process where the numbers are being discussed by the sectors, where they're being questioned, where assumptions even can be questioned and ranges of assumptions can be looked at to see how robust is what the government is proposing, is going to be important. It's not done through a study, it's done through a process.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do a quick lightning round before we jump to some closing comments from Ambroise Fayol, the Vice President for the European Investment Bank. But to the entire panel, we started off by talking about, Sunga offered the presentation explaining how the MDBs are beginning to think about this more systematically, in a way that we can offer similar type of guidance when each of us talks individually to a client government. So advice, I want your advice for me and my colleagues when we're working on this in country. What's the best thing we could do to help countries advance their LTS work? And then what would be an absolute disaster if we were to do something regarding LTS work? Help guide us, use your insights into what you're seeing on the ground, to make sure we're all rowing in the same direction, but we're also providing the best possible support that we can to you. Caroline, let's start with you.
Thank you. And I think the best or the main recommendation will be to work with us. It is good for us to have studies, but the thing is that we need to develop capacities in the ministries and in subnational level, for example. And when you came to us and work with us and you support us with professionals that are in our team and work together with you, we have the better results that we could have. I think that is, if you ask me one thing, I think that is one of the main things that help us in order to develop this instrument that, as was Richard was saying, it must be a process. But in order to help in that process, you need to understand what is going on in the country. And for that, you need to be working with us.
Okay. Alzbeta, you had mentioned that support, a strong messaging in support of carbon pricing was going to be very helpful. Any other ideas that you think MDBs should be pushing on as we support countries on their LTS work?
Thank you, Steve. A couple of ideas. I think a couple of speakers on this panel already mentioned that LTS has to be in line with a broader development strategy and a broader resource strategy. And we have an opportunity today to look at the resource situation of many countries, which can help alleviate some of the climate issues. And I'm thinking renewable energy potential, connection of renewable energy potential to all the other industries to electrify them. And the second point I'd like to highlight is that in today's world, the boundaries between many industries are blurring, and I'm sure Carolina in Chile, you are thinking about green ammonia, green hydrogen. Basically, the industry that touches energy is probably going to be the same industry tomorrow that touches food and marine transportation fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So looking at it holistically and looking at it from the broader country perspective rather than just bucketed industrial strategies would be very helpful.
Okay, Taka and Richard, again, very quick, short guidance for MDBs on what we can do well to help countries on LTS work.
I think it'd be great still to continue the current effort of the MDBs to mainstream the country programs and also the sector level investment planning with the support for the LDC implementation. I think this mainstreaming is key. And also just inspired by your comment, I think it'd be great if probably together with the bilateral donors and the MDBs could support more in the data and information science and the research institutes at the national level and the local level as well, and that would be probably helpful.
Richard, final words?
Yes, for me, so definitely on capacity, building up capacity to handle this as time goes by and not flying in out advice. I think tying it to your own alignment mandate inside MDBs is critical. So develop the work with countries with a view to steer their and your infrastructure investment and policy decisions. I think that's how we phrase it.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you very much, Richard. Thank you, Alzbeta. Thank you, Carolina. Thank you, Taka. Really appreciate all the information you shared with us today, your unique insights as the authors of these, as the technical advisors, and as the consumers to this type of information. We really appreciate that. Let me just kind of remind us where we started. It was hearing about where the MDBs are heading as a group of institutions and as individual institutions to try and provide more support to governments on what is an increasingly popular area of focus. Again, NDCs, countries have now been through 2 rounds of preparing their NDCs. LTSs are still new. Richard mentioned that we may be getting upwards of 40 countries who have now prepared these. That means there's a lot more to go. And so the information that needs to be shared, the type of technical support that needs to be shared is absolutely crucial, that we focus on how to build that knowledge sharing capacity, how to build additional resources into the system so that countries can do the necessary analytic work, undertake the studies, engage in that stakeholder work that Carolina talked about. 2,000 stakeholders who participated in the Chilean plan development. How do we support that? So, thank you again for all of the insights today. Really appreciate it. And now I'd like to turn it over to Ambroise to talk a little bit more from EIB's perspective about this whole issue of long-term strategies. Ambroise, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thanks a lot for the great conversation. Actually, I enjoyed that a lot. And if I can just pick up of what I heard, I think the point that you make, Carolina, about it is not only long-term strategies are at the national level, it's also something that you have to do at the sectoral level or at the municipality level, and this is something that I think is very, very important and relevant. I was just before this event to the signature of, or not to the signature, to an event on celebrating what we call the GAP Fund, which has been created by the support from Germany and Luxembourg, and the World Bank and EIB are the implementing agencies for this. We are doing that really as a combination. It's working with cities, and it's working with a very early stage preparation for strategies for cities. You know, it's a combination of very complex energy, water, wastewater, transport policies. So that's the kind of the new fund that I think is really adding something related to the discussion on the long-term strategy. And I think the debate that we have seen also evolve in the MDB community in this year makes me very optimistic that we are moving towards having much more coordination, much more work, maybe also together with a way to find a new facility to put this long-term strategy in place. It's initiative that is needed to support the countries, and especially the least developed countries, actually. And I think what the G20 has pushed and we have endorsed as MDBs is certainly going to be welcome. We, as the Bank of the European Union, are completely supportive of these policies. I mean, you know that we are in a big exercise of transforming EIB into the EU Climate Bank. So we are really targeting this oriented. So we are very pleased with the developments on long-term strategy, because also we think that this is something that is absolutely needed if we want to achieve the targets, and if we want to help actually the clients, be it governments, be it subnational entities, and of course the people who live in the ground.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, again, I think what you just heard is why we have a joint pavilion in Glasgow and why MDBs work collaboratively on these issues, because we recognize the value of collaboration. We recognize the importance of ensuring that we have some consistency in terms of how we approach these issues with the governments and the businesses that we work with. And so I thought that was a really resounding endorsement of exactly why we have sessions like today, the one we did today, where we talk about the work that we've been engaging in the past months and what that means in terms of the support we'll be able to provide to our clients going forward. So today was on long-term strategies, yesterday's was on just transition. A few days ago we had one on Article 6, and next week we'll be talking about gender and transportation, and we'll be talking about our collective work in cities. So please come back next week. Join us for more of these events from the MDB Pavilion at COP26 in Glasgow. Thank you again to all of the panel for joining us, and have a good afternoon and evening, everybody. Thank you very much.